Hello and welcome to Frank's School. I want to go on with some of the stuff that I learned from Peter Quintran, or however you say his name. When we were talking on the plane, he had not, I don't think he'd yet realized how interested I would be in what he had to say. But at a certain point, we got talking about granite. He remembered as a boy going up on the mountain and cutting the granite out of the mountainside, quarrying, we would say. And he, this was just beginning to remember things as a child. He remembered working with the men. I was immediately fascinated because I saw so much granite used in this area of Portugal. Later I'll show it to you again as the videos run, how much they use granite. And granite is a hard material to work, so I was interested in that. And I said, well, how did you do that? And he said, well, it was a lot of pounding. But they used black powder. And I said, oh, you did? And he said, oh, yeah, to knock the enormous blocks off the mountainside. He was talking about quarrying. But then splitting it down, cutting it down, there was work. Granite was worked everywhere. And here he mentioned the cows and the yoked together with the ox cart. We would call them oxen, but he called them cows, and I think they were cows. They were not oxen because they also produce milk. They had quite a job to do. I'll tell you more about them in a minute. But he'd say yes, they would bring the stone down from the mountain in these ox carts or cow carts, and he remembered using a tripod to lift the blocks up to set them in the wall to build the houses. You see these houses there, so many of them, were solid granite. Depending on where you go in Portugal, solid granite houses. I'm talking stones that big, might be typical, lifted and set there. And he said, and they were set only in clay. It wasn't mortar, they were just set there. And men would work together to do that. I'll tell you later, this seems to have been, when he was a boy, an economy that just had no money, or almost no money in the economy. They worked together. He was a boy. He remembered doing it. And I was very interested in how to cut that granite, because at some point I'll be showing you, but I saw granite fence posts, tens of thousands of granite fence posts, granite about that big and maybe that high fence posts, granite, and how you cut that. I did want to tell you that see, nowadays when they work in stone, they saw it, a lot of it. They saw it. They didn't in the old days. It was split, cleft work, and cleft work. You drill a hole. You have a star drill, and you pound it and turn it and pound it and turn it and pound until you made a hole about that deep. And then I guess he remembered, probably because it was so much fun, the explosion of black powder. But then you'd use feathers and a wedge. You can see this on YouTube if you look up splitting stone, feathers and wedges. You can find YouTube videos where you'll see guys doing that. They'll put them in there and they'll pound them in a line and split the stone. It's pretty neat to see done, but it is time consuming. And nowadays they use an impact hammer, and it still takes a while. But before it was pounding all those holes. I have some star drills. I should have brought one in to show you. I saw it done one time in New Hampshire. I lived in New Hampshire for longer than I really wanted to, and that's called the Granite State. And at one time a carpenter, I worked for this man from Pennsylvania, Don Booth, and one of his carpenters had worked in a quarry and knew how to split stone. And after work, we quit work early one day for him to show us how he could split a real big granite boulder. Now I had to go. I didn't see it actually split, but I saw him start to do it. And you have to see the rift. And I had trouble seeing it. There's a rift, there's grain, and there's head grain. And if all of it works, this is the easiest to split. You know, in wood, you may basically just talk about grain. That's the easiest to split. And then the grain is at a 45, and the head grain is harder. And if it all works right, you've got something that comes out like a cube. So I've seen it done, and they must have done it. And I had to wonder, you know, how they kept those star drills sharp. The blacksmith must have been such an important character in that village economy. All right, these two cows with their yokes in the cart, and I'll tell you about the schedule of the cows here in just a minute, but I mentioned the blacksmith. I asked him, well, what kind of trades were there? I mean, I didn't say that. I first said, did the village have a blacksmith? And he said, yes, it had a blacksmith. And he was also a farrier. The cows were shod, just like we have horseshoes. Horses have shoes that work a lot. Well, the cows were shod, he said. And the blacksmith did that. There was also a mason. For a 500-person village, there was one mason. But he said mostly they didn't use mortar, just if there were chimneys. And there weren't that many chimneys. I'll tell you about that later. I said, what about your shoes? What did you do for shoes? And he said, well, they were wooden. You see, he said everybody made their own stuff. Were there carpenters? I said, well, no. The people just made their own stuff. He said there was one farmer who had on the side, it was kind of his specialty, he did make the wooden part of the shoe, but they would have a leather strap that would go over it, and he remembered nailing pieces of tire on the bottom side to make them last longer or to get more friction or something. He seemed to remember that pretty clearly. Remember, he's mostly remembering when he was a boy. Now the priest was very, very important in this village. And on another video, I'll tell you a little bit more that he told me about the village life. But those are pretty much the only craftsmen that were there. Now the schedule of the cows. He said that they would go out to pasture in the morning, first thing, alone. Then they would yoke them together and work for several hours. Then in the middle of the day, they would still leave them yoked, but they would graze to rest, and then work some more. And then when they would take them home, they would take the yoke off, and then they could graze individually. Hay was a very big crop. He said you had to cut so much hay. And of course that's the case here too, but when you only have two cows, that's one thing. And the hay fields and the grain fields were different from the quintais. They were designated. It's from what he said, the rotation did not involve hay and grain. I asked if the fields got tired, and he said no, as long as you fertilize them. And I heard that word fertilize, he meant manure. The only thing they ever put on manure was manure, and that they saved it all. And he said as long as you're always putting the manure back on the fields, you had hay and you had grain. Now the other animals that they had a pig, I think only one, which they would butcher in the fall. Smoke the meat over their heads in their houses. I'll tell you more about that later. They had chickens. One of the few things that they could sell to get money was eggs. Once a part of the economy was the first Monday of every month there was a feta, a market day, and they would take things there to sell. They sold rabbits. He called them bunnies. Sometimes they would have a turkey, but he pointed out that the turkeys were mean birds. He said, boy, when you butchered them, you had to give them liquor. I think he said absinthe or something like that. And then it was no problem. But he was a little afraid of the turkeys. Ducks he would take them down to the river. Sheep, he had memories about sheep actually being afraid, genuinely afraid of wolves as a boy with the sheep. That was a serious business, wolves there. And also snakes. No dogs, cats, and no guineas, that he remembered. I said, what about rats? What about mice and rats? He said, oh yeah, they had a lot of rats. And so I was a little surprised that they didn't have cats, but he said not that he remembered. The cows, and I assume the pig, lived underneath the house. And underneath there were no windows. I asked him, no, just the door. And I said, how would you see to clean it? And he said, well, when they'd open the doors wide, the light would go in there. and that's where the animals were. Uh, well, you know, I worry a little bit that I just seem to be rambling, but I don't think I will be. I just his talk about granite really set me off. I really even did some research. This idea of cleaving, splitting wood or stone as opposed to sawing it comes back to this kilocalories as currency. You know, even though there's so much work, and he kept saying about that granite, oh, it was so much work, so much work. That was work that was manpower. That wasn't run by engines or electricity or big saws, and it didn't make scrap. I have more memories than I have time for in this class. When I lived in Brazil, I remember a woman, an old woman, that worked. Well, they split granite there too, and they paved. All those paving stones were cut by hand. You know, cut about that big. There's probably no scrap at all. And this one woman, I remember her all day. She sat with a short-handled hammer and broke up stones, and then she would sell little buckets about the size of a gallon can of gravel, we would call it, broken stone. Would sell them to the masons. That was how she made her living, all day, breaking stone. All right, well, I still have a lot more to tell you about him. I can only hope that I can keep you mildly interested in this, but in any case, I do want to leave a record of what he told me about his life there. So see you next time.